May 27th, Space Force debuted on Netflix. This has been one of the most hyped shows of the year because, in part, Greg Daniels, the creator of The Office, and his star for the first 7 seasons of that show, Steve Carell, were going to be teaming up and doing something. Also, there was just all this ad space, so if there's a lot of ad space, there's a lot of ads for the past month that have been playing about the show, as well as, winter and spring previews that have been talking about the show. That adds to a lot of the hype. Also, it's a very high-concept show, and people were curious about whether they could pull off this concept. The concept is basically a government operation that's modeled off of Trump's idea of a space force. Trump tweeted this idea that we should have a space force, part of the Air Force, but deals with space issues. As far as I know, he might still be doing it. The show is surprisingly apolitical, and I'll get to that later, but I want to also mention that the reaction to the show has been kind of negative, and I want to make this video to counteract some of that negative perception. A lot of the negativity, as far as I can tell, stems from the fact that critics often only get 3 episodes of a show to review, when the show could be 12 to 26 episodes long per season. And this show worked itself out a lot in the back half of the season, so that you were much more attached to the characters and plots were coming together. The same thing most famously happened in 2014 with BoJack Horseman on Netflix, and a lot of the reviewers apologized later and kept watching the show. But if you look at those season 1 reviews on Rotten Tomato, they were not particularly flattering. The show is based on something that's happening today in the news, which is generally a red flag to audiences. And a lot of show creators want to stay away from things that are too topical. You want your show to be relevant to society, of course, but you don't want your show to be too on the nose about news, for 3 reasons. First, people get a lot of news, especially a lot of news has not been pretty. During the coronavirus, the riots, the Trump administration, the, deportation, all kinds of stuff that have been happening, and people have news to remind them of the news, so they want their entertainment to be properly escapist. Number 2 is that showrunners don't want their shows to feel dated, especially from a financial standpoint. Television shows make a lot of money in syndication, so I don't want to make a show that only makes sense if you're watching it in May of 2020 and, can't remember these events if they happen in May of, 2028. Lastly, there is a lot of polarizing culture wars, again, in culture, and if showrunners can stay clear of that culture war and be seen as preaching on one half of the divide or the other, it's generally the better for them, because unless they're specifically making a show that wants to get in on that debate, and there are exceptions to that, of course, they want their show to be remembered for their messages, for what it's trying to say, for their acting, for their characters, for their writing. They don't want to be remembered because it's a left-wing show or a right-wing show, or their commentary. There are exceptions, of course. Aaron Sorkin, when he made The West Wing of the Newsroom, he definitely wanted to preach. Law and Order loves to take topics of the day. Apparently, Good Wife, which I think is a great show. Its spin-off, I believe, Good Girls, has been doing a lot more of that, as well as a number of shows lately that are part of the resurgence of shows of like black programming or the African American community, like Atlanta or Insecure or Dear White People. They're made for a niche audience that wants that commentary. I remember Mike Schur, the creator of The Good Place and a protege of Greg Daniels of The Office, said that he was really lucky that he thought of the show before the Trump administration, where these ethical points can be debated without people thinking that their commentary explicitly on the present. That makes the commentary more timeless, and that the characters on the show actually died all well before the Trump administration, so that nothing going on in the Trump administration is relevant to the show. So in terms of this show, I believe, stays fairly apolitical, but it also is satirical, and that's a really fine line to tread. So when it comes to being apolitical, I think part of it is that part of its targets, such as government bureaucracies, military stringencies, and xenophobia and stereotypes are all here, and that is pretty much relevant to any presidential administration. There's also stuff like having to do stuff because the president tweeted it, or a distrust of science that also is more on the nose with this administration, but it's not so on the nose that it feels like everything's preachy. It's just a couple jabs to remind us that, of this person's target. But despite making a show satirizing a stupid concept created by Donald Trump, it's a show that can stand on its own, I think. Because it's a stupid concept, there's plenty of room for the stupidity that drives the comedy. I mean, there's certainly suspension of disbelief when they start putting people on the moon that have not had any vetting at all, and you could see that they're in a rush timetable, which also draws to the comedy, but it also, there's heart to the show, and there's humor that does not necessarily originate from politics. In terms of the heart, the character of Mark Naird, portrayed by Steve Carell, because of that science versus authority debate, science versus military debate, science versus the Trump administration debate, femininity versus toxic masculinity. There's a lot of things that are, a lot of dichotomies that are encapsulated in the relationship between John Malkovich's character of Adrian Mallory, who's the sort of foil and the person with the second most screen time next to General Mark Naird, played by Steve Carell once again. Because of that, there's a lot to play with there, and there's a lot of other side characters who sort of reinforce that. There's a woman who's in the military, and she's kind of climbing her way up the ranks. There's a second in command in terms of on the science side. There's kind of a lackey. There's a PR person, which again is probably more of a Trump-specific commentary, because Trump is generally about image, and the PR person is all about image. But again, the PR person, he's played by Ben Schwartz, and there's just a lot to make fun of him in spite of it. Like an uplifting drama, these characters are moving towards a goal, but there's room within that goal for comedy. We're also cued towards the fact that this is a character that we want to like because it's played by the same guy as Michael Scott. And part of the reason people didn't like the first 3 episodes is that Michael Scott, the Michael Scott character is definitely a buffoon who doesn't listen. And it's the same way The Office went, but you generally see the person being turned around for the better as the show goes on. And it's the same way in this show as he improves and listens a bit more. And yeah, he's an idiot, but there's definitely some negotiation about him and the people around him. So I think it is a really good show. I think it's because they created a really good cast of characters with actors that it's really hard to miss with. Ben Schwartz and, Jessica St. Clair, and, some of these guys are just very difficult to not laugh at their characters. So I think it's a really good show, and I think it is worth checking past the first 3 episodes.